A 19-year-old American is kneeling on the dirt floor of a German cellar in the spring of 1945. He is unarmed. He is wearing a red cross on his helmet and another on the brassard around his upper arm, and he is cleaning a graze wound on the arm of a man who, if their positions were reversed, would almost certainly have killed him. The man in the chair is a Waffen SS officer, a prisoner captured that morning, walked into this cellar under American guard. Wounded enough to need a medic, not wounded enough to be quiet, the boy with the gauze pad in his hand does not know who this man is. He does not know what unit he served in. He does not know which villages, in which countries this officer has walked through in the last 6 years, or what was left in those villages after he walked out. What he knows is the wound, the angle of it, the bleeding, the order in which to clean it. He kneels. He works, and in the next 2 seconds, the SS officer is going to do something that will end up in a file in Washington. And the boy in the cellar is going to make a decision that the entire architecture of the post-war world will turn on. He doesn't know it yet. He just feels his cheek go hot. This is the story of that cellar and that slap and what happened in the 8 months that followed. It is also the story of the general who commanded the army that boy belonged to, a man whose name you already know. A man whose name has been told and retold for 80 years, in books and in films, in the language of bravado and pearl-handled revolvers, and a particular kind of American legend. His name was George Smith Patton, Jr. He was 59 years old, and 18 months before that morning in the cellar, he had walked into an American field hospital in Sicily and slapped 2 of his own soldiers across the face. For being, in his opinion, too sick to be in the beds they were lying in. His career had nearly ended over those slaps. He had been forced to apologize publicly to his own army, and in the same campaign he had given a pre-battle speech that the United States military's own investigators would later read into a court-martial record as language that may have authorized the killing of prisoners. This is who was going to receive the report from that cellar. To understand the man and the choice and the cost of both, you have to begin 3 weeks earlier than the cellar. Not on a dirt floor, on a bridge. On the night of March 22nd, 1945, a pontoon bridge swayed at the German town of Oppenheim, held upright by engineers who hadn't slept in 48 hours. Across it moved the lead elements of an army that had not stopped advancing since the hedgerows of Normandy. 7 months of continuous combat. 1,200 miles, a trail of dead and a record of motion that no commander in the European theatre could match. The general who commanded that army stood at the western edge of the bridge in the cold March wind. He unbuttoned his trousers. He stepped to the edge of the planking, and he urinated into the Rhine. He turned to his aide and said only, "I have been looking forward to this for a long time." This is the kind of detail that has come to define Patton in popular memory, the bravado, the vulgarity. The deliberate theatre of a general who knew history was watching and intended to give it something to remember. But the man at the edge of that bridge was not only a showman. He was also a man under quiet judgment. In 8 months, 3 governments and a generation of historians would convene a courtroom in a German city called Nuremberg. And the question they would ask in that courtroom was a question Patton himself had already been forced to answer. What does a soldier owe the law? To understand what happened in the weeks that followed the Rhine crossing, you have to understand what was in Patton's mind and what was already on his record when he stood at that bridge. By early April 1945, the Third Army he commanded had reached a size that belongs more to statistics than to imagination. Between 12 and 15 divisions on any given day, a mix of armour infantry, mechanized cavalry, corps artillery, engineer battalions, signal companies, quartermaster units, medical battalions strung along supply lines that ran 600 miles back to Antwerp. Inside those divisions were several 100,000 individual soldiers. Most of them between the ages of 18 and 26. They had fought through France in August, through Lorraine in November, through the snow and frozen mud of the Ardennes in December and January, when American casualties had reached numbers not seen since Normandy. By March, the survivors had a particular look in their eyes. They were not boys anymore. They had not been boys for some time. Among them, in nearly every battalion, were the medics, the men who wore the Red Cross on their helmets, who carried no weapons or in some cases only a sidearm authorized by army regulation, who ran toward fire while everyone else dropped flat, who pulled wounded men out of the open by their belts and their collars and whatever else they could grab, who treated the wounded of both sides under a status that international law had spent nearly a century building. That status had a name. It was the Geneva Convention, two of them in fact, the Convention of 1929 relative to the treatment of prisoners of war, and the Convention of 1929 for the amelioration of the condition of the wounded and sick in armies in the field. Both signed by the United States, both signed by Germany. The Red Cross on a medic's helmet was not a courtesy. It was law. By April 1945, that law was about to be tested. The Third Army was taking prisoners on a scale the European theatre had not seen. When the war ended, the total would exceed 750,000 German soldiers captured by Patton's army alone. Among them were men of the Wehrmacht, men of the Luftwaffe, men of the Volkssturm, the Home Guard, and among them, in the tens of thousands, were members of the Waffen SS. The Waffen SS in the spring of 1945 was a force in collapse but not in surrender. Its senior divisions had fought on every front for years. The 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte, the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitler Jugend, they carried a record of tactical effectiveness and a record of atrocity and an institutional culture that had spent a decade teaching its men that the laws governing other soldiers did not govern them. The American soldiers handling them knew this. They had learned it, in particular, on the 17th of December, 1944. At a crossroads near a Belgian village called Baugnez, soldiers of Kampfgruppe Pieper, an armoured task force of the 1st SS Panzer Division, had captured a column of unarmed Americans from Battery B of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion. They had herded them into an open field, and they had opened fire with machine guns. 84 men were murdered there. The incident became known as the Malmedy Massacre. By March 1945, no American soldier in any unit near the German border was unaware of Malmedy. The name had passed into the language of the war. So when Waffen SS prisoners began moving rearward through the American lines in the spring of 1945, they were not moving through neutral territory. They were moving through soldiers who remembered, and in among those soldiers, at the forward edge of the medical chain, were the medics. The battalion aid station in 1945 was not a hospital, it was the first organized medical element behind the front line. A surgeon, usually a captain, between 4 and 8 enlisted men, a farmhouse cellar, a stone barn, an abandoned schoolhouse. Sometimes nothing but a tarp strung between trees. Wounded men arrived there, carried, dragged, walking. They were sorted, they were stabilized. They were sent rearward. When German prisoners arrived at or near these stations, the law was unambiguous. Wounded German soldiers received the same medical attention as wounded Americans, prioritized by severity of injury. This was not a courtesy. It was policy at every level of command, and it was reinforced by directive from Third Army headquarters. That headquarters, in the first week of April 1945, was a moving command post somewhere east of the Rhine. The general who commanded from it was the man who had stood at the bridge at Oppenheim. And on the desk of his Judge Advocate General were beginning to arrive a particular kind of report. Incidents, small ones. An SS prisoner who had spat at a medic working on a wounded German. An SS prisoner who had refused treatment from a Jewish American doctor. An SS prisoner who, at a battalion aid station somewhere in the zone, had raised his hand and struck an unarmed American medical soldier across the face. The reports moved up the chain. The reports reached the Judge Advocate section. The reports, in summary form, reached the desk of General Patton himself. And here is where the story becomes a story about a man rather than a system. Because the man who would decide how the Third Army responded to a Waffen SS prisoner striking an American medic was a man with two specific entries in his own record. The first entry was dated the 3rd of August, 1943. At the 15th Evacuation Hospital, near Nicosia, Sicily, General Patton, then a Lieutenant General commanding the 7th Army, had walked through a tent of wounded men and stopped at the cot of Private Charles H. Cool, 27 years old, an infantryman from Mishawaka, Indiana. Cool was suffering from chronic dysentery and malaria. His fever was 102 degrees. He told the general he was nervous. He said he guessed he couldn't take it. Patton slapped him across the face with a pair of gloves. He grabbed Cool by the collar, he dragged him from the tent and kicked him out the back. The second entry was dated 1 week later. The 10th of August 1943, at the 93rd Evacuation Hospital near Santo Stefano, Private Paul G. Bennett of the 17th Field Artillery Regiment, 21 years old, 5'4", ordered to the hospital by his own medics over his own protests. Bennett mentioned his nerves. Patton called him a coward. Patton drew his pistol from the holster and waved it in the young man's face. He struck him with an open hand. Then he struck him again. He shouted that the soldier ought to be lined up against a wall and shot. The incidents had nearly ended Patton's career. They had cost him command for nearly a year. They had been resolved only by Eisenhower's intervention. By forced public apologies to the men of the 7th Army, by a decision at the highest levels to keep Patton on the bench during Normandy and to use his name as a decoy in the deception plan that supported the landings. The man now setting policy on the protection of unarmed medical soldiers from violence by enemy prisoners was the same man who 18 months earlier had struck unarmed American medical patients in their own hospital beds. This is the first contradiction of this story. There is a second. There is, on Patton's record, an investigation that has been quieter in popular memory than the slapping incidents, but heavier in its implications. On the 14th of July, 1943, near a Sicilian airfield called Biscari, soldiers of the 180th Infantry Regiment of the 45th Infantry Division IN, a unit operating inside Patton's 7th Army Zone, killed approximately 76 German and Italian prisoners of war in two separate incidents. The men responsible were named Sergeant Horace T. West, Captain John T. Compton. Both were tried by court-martial. West was convicted. He was later pardoned. Compton was acquitted. The investigation that followed included testimony and a written record of a speech Patton had given to officers of the 45th Infantry Division before the Sicily landings. In that speech, according to the testimony entered into the record, Patton had used language that could reasonably be interpreted as permission, or even encouragement, not to take prisoners under certain combat conditions. Patton denied that interpretation. The matter was officially closed, but the speech was on the record, and the question it raised was on the record. The man who would now decide how to handle SS prisoners who attacked American medics was the same man who in 1943 had given a speech that some of his own subordinates believed had authorized the killing of prisoners. This is who he was, not a villain, not a hero, a man, and the reports were arriving on his desk. The reports were brief, a line, 2 lines, sometimes a paragraph. They were typed on the standard Army carbon forms used for incident summaries in the spring of 1945, and they moved up the chain of command the way reports always moved. From the aid station clerk to the battalion adjutant, from the adjutant to the regimental staff, from the regiment to the division, from the division to the corps, from the corps to 3rd Army headquarters. By the time they reached the desk of the 3rd Army Judge Advocate, they were already 3 or 4 days old. He read them the way he read everything, with a fountain pen in his hand, with a list of priorities in his head, with the knowledge that what he decided in the next 10 minutes would become part of a record other men in other rooms would read for the rest of the century. One of those reports, in the first week of April 1945, described an incident at a forward aid station somewhere in the operational zone of 3rd Army. It described a young American medic, it described an SS officer in custody, and it described a slap. The aid station that morning sat in the cellar of a stone farmhouse, half a mile behind the line of advance, in the rolling hill country east of the Rhine. It had been a kitchen once. There were still copper pans on hooks above the cold hearth. There was still the smell of the family that had lived there, layered under the smell of antiseptic and damp wool and old smoke from the wood the surgeon was burning in a tin stove to keep the wounded warm. The surgeon was a captain. He was 31 years old. He was from somewhere in Pennsylvania, and he had not slept more than 4 hours at a stretch in 3 weeks. His enlisted men, the medics, were younger. The oldest was 24. The youngest, the one who would become the center of the report that reached Third Army headquarters, was 19. He was from a small town. The town doesn't matter. There were 10,000 of him in the European theater, and what mattered was not where he came from, but what was on his helmet. The white circle, the red cross. That morning the wounded who came in were mostly German. 2 of them were Waffen SS. One was a young grenadier with shrapnel in his thigh. The other was an officer. The officer's wound was minor. A graze to the upper arm. He could walk, he could stand, he could speak, and what he chose to do when the 19-year-old American knelt in front of him to clean the wound was lift his right hand and strike the medic across the face with the back of it. The blow was hard enough to turn the medic's head. The cellar went silent. The surgeon, 4 feet away, set down the suture he was holding. The other wounded men, the Americans on the floor and the Germans against the wall, looked up. The medic did not stand. He did not raise his hand to his cheek. He did not reach for the sidearm at his hip, the M1911 pistol that medics were sometimes authorized to carry for the defense of their wounded, and use it on the man in front of him. He looked at the SS officer for 1 second, 2 seconds, then he picked up the gauze pad he had dropped and he resumed cleaning the wound. When the wound was clean, he stood up. He walked to the surgeon. He said, in a voice the surgeon would describe later as flat and tired and entirely controlled, "Sir, I need to make a report." This is the moment that earns telling, not the slap. The slap was nothing. The slap was a man losing his discipline in front of someone he had been raised to consider an inferior, and there was nothing exceptional about it in the spring of 1945. What was exceptional was the response. A 19-year-old American, in a cellar full of armed enemies and witnesses he didn't fully trust, made a calculation in the half-second after that blow connected. He had options. The legal options included retaliation in self-defense, which under the circumstances might have been excused. The illegal options were broader, and no one in that cellar would have testified against him if he had used them. He chose neither. He chose the report. The historians who write about command and discipline in the United States Army tend to write about generals, about corps commanders, about the men whose names appear on monuments, but the discipline of an army is not made at that level. It is made in cellars like that one, in decisions like that one, by 19-year-olds whose names are not preserved. The medic in the cellar that morning did something the entire legal architecture of the post-war world would depend on. He trusted the system. He believed, for whatever reason, that the chain of command above him would take a written report and do something with it. He was, as it turned out, correct, but he had no way of knowing he was correct. He was just a man in a basement with a sore jaw doing his job. The report he dictated to the surgeon that morning was 4 sentences long. The surgeon, who had been a country doctor in Pennsylvania before the war, knew the form. He wrote the date, he wrote the location, encoded grid reference, he wrote the names and units of the American personnel present, the descriptions of the prisoners, the sequence of events. He signed it. He gave it to the battalion runner, who took it to the battalion command post, where the adjutant initialed it, attached it to a routing slip, and sent it forward. By the time it reached the judge advocate's desk at Third Army headquarters, it had been touched by 6 pairs of hands. He read it twice, he set it aside, he picked up his pen and wrote a single line of routing instructions on the cover sheet. Then he placed it in the wire basket labeled Outgoing, where it joined approximately 60 other documents that would move that day to the office of the theatre judge advocate, Colonel Edward C. Betts, at Supreme Headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force, then located in Reims, France. This is what bureaucracy looks like when it works. Not dramatic, not loud, a piece of paper on a clean desk, a pen mark, a wire basket. The bureaucracy of the United States Army in 1945 was the largest legal apparatus any military force in history had ever fielded. It produced, in the European theatre alone, more than 30,000 courts-martial during the war. It documented, in the closing weeks of the conflict, thousands of incidents involving prisoner mistreatment, civilian abuse, looting, and violations of the laws of war by personnel of all the combatant powers. It produced a record. That record, in the spring of 1945, was beginning to be sorted by a small group of men in London and Washington who were preparing for something that had never existed before in the history of warfare. Their names belong in this story because what they were doing was directly connected to what happened in that cellar. Robert H. Jackson was a Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. He was 53 years old. In May 1945, he would be appointed by President Truman to serve as the Chief United States Prosecutor at the International Military Tribunal that would be convened in the German city of Nuremberg. He would spend the rest of his life remembered for the address he gave at the opening of those proceedings. In London, a Polish-born British professor of international law named Hersch Lauterpacht was drafting, in the spring of 1945, the legal language that would describe a category of crime that had not until that moment existed in international law. He would call it crimes against humanity. The phrase was new, the concept was new. The principle that individuals could be held criminally accountable under international law for acts they committed in the name of a state was new. These men did not know about the cellar, they did not know about the slap, they did not know about the 19-year-old American who had asked, on a morning in early April, to make a report. But they were building, in their offices in London and Washington, the architecture that would receive that report. The London Charter that established the legal framework of the Nuremberg trials would not be signed until August 8, 1945. The trials themselves would not open until November 20th. The verdicts would not be delivered until October 1st, 1946. All of that was still ahead. What existed in the first week of April 1945 was a chain of paperwork moving from a cellar in Germany toward a desk in Reims, and the dim awareness in the men who were processing it that something larger was being built. There was a reason General Patton, in that same week, was inclined to support the formal handling of these incidents through the legal system rather than through any extra-legal alternative. The reason was on his record. He had paid for Sicily. He had paid for it publicly, in front of his own men, in apologies he had not wanted to give to soldiers he had not wanted to apologize to. He had paid for it again in the long silence of 1944, when his career had nearly ended, when his name had been used as a decoy, when Eisenhower had chosen Bradley over him for the most consequential commands of the war. He was not going to pay for it a third time. Whatever Patton believed in private about the Waffen SS, and his diary entries from this period make clear that what he believed in private was not yet the contempt he would later feel. He understood by April 1945 that his command climate was watched. His decisions were reported. His every gesture toward a prisoner, a civilian, a hospitalized soldier, was a paragraph in a future biography he was not yet allowed to read. The investigation of the Biscari massacre 2 years earlier had reached high enough to put Patton's pre-battle speech to the 45th Division into the formal record. He had been questioned about that speech. He had defended himself. The matter had been closed, but it had not been forgotten, and Patton was not a man who needed reminders of how close he had come, twice now, to losing everything. So when reports of SS prisoners attacking American medical personnel reached his headquarters, he did the thing his record demanded. He routed them through the system. He let his judge advocate handle them. He let the JAG section build the file. He did not visit the cellar. He did not interview the SS officer. He did not, in any of the documented record that survives from this period, give the matter more than a passing glance. He had learned the lesson Sicily had taught him. The lesson was not that violence against helpless men was wrong. He was not, by April 1945, a man transformed in that particular way. The lesson was that violence against helpless men was expensive. And he could not afford it. The system absorbed the report. The report joined a growing file. The file was one of thousands. And in the same week that file was moving across desks in Reims, the men of 2 American infantry divisions in Patton's Third Army were approaching a place in the forest of Thuringia that would change the way Patton understood the war he had been fighting. The place was a small German town called Ohrdruf. It sat in pleasant country, the kind of country that looks in spring like a painting of itself. There were apple orchards, there was a stream, there was a small medieval church with a copper roof gone green. On the southern edge of the town, half a mile from the last house, there was a camp. The 4th Armoured Division reached it first on the 4th of April 1945. The 18th Infantry Division arrived in the following days. What they found inside the camp was a piece of evidence so large that, in the days that followed, the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe would personally travel from his headquarters to see it, and would order every soldier in the theatre not currently in combat to do the same. What they found was a sub-camp of the larger concentration camp at Buchenwald. In the 72 hours before the American advance reached Ohrdruf, the SS guards had murdered the surviving prisoners. They had shot them at the edges of trenches, they had clubbed them in the barracks, they had burned bodies on improvised pyres of railroad ties and gasoline. They had set fire to the records building, and they had marched whatever prisoners remained alive on a forced evacuation toward Buchenwald itself, killing the stragglers as they walked. When the American soldiers entered the camp on the 4th of April, the fires were still smoking. There were more than 3,000 bodies inside. General Patton arrived on the 12th of April. He came with General Eisenhower, he came with General Omar Bradley, he came with a Signal Corps photographer, and with a small staff, and with the deliberate intention of making the camp official. Witnessed, recorded. The 3 generals walked together through the perimeter. They did not speak much. Eisenhower, the calmest of the 3 by temperament, looked at everything. He stopped at each pile. He insisted, twice, on entering buildings his aides suggested he skip. He turned to Bradley at one point and said, quietly, in a sentence that would later appear in his own memoir, that he wanted every American soldier not currently at the front line to come and see this place. He said he wanted them to know what they were fighting against. Bradley would write, in his book A Soldier's Story, published in 1951, about what happened to Patton inside that camp. Patton, who had stood at the Rhine 3 weeks earlier and made a show of contempt for the country across it, walked behind one of the prisoner barracks. He vomited into the grass. He stayed there, leaning forward with his hands on his knees, for what Bradley remembered as a long time. Then he straightened up. He walked back out. He resumed the tour. He did not refer to the moment again that day or any other. The same day, the 12th of April, in a small wooden cottage in Warm Springs, Georgia, 6,000 miles to the west, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt sat for a portrait, said the words, "I have a terrific headache," and lost consciousness. He died at 3:35 that afternoon of a cerebral hemorrhage in the cottage where he had gone to rest. The news reached Patton in the evening. The man whose career he owed to Roosevelt, whose continuation in command after Sicily had depended on Roosevelt's confidence in him, was gone. The war he had spent 5 years fighting was 26 days from ending, and the place he had walked through that afternoon was not, he understood, the worst that was still to be found. The next day Patton gave the order. The townspeople of Ohrdruf, every man and woman over the age of 18, would walk to the camp under American military escort. They would view the pits, they would view the bodies, they would view what their countrymen had done in the name of the state they had elected and supported, and now conveniently decided they had known nothing about. The order was carried out on the 13th and the 14th of April. The mayor of Ohrdruf walked the tour with his wife. He returned to his house. That night he and his wife went together into a small room of their home. They were found the following morning. They had taken their own lives. The Signal Corps photographs of Ohrdruf were printed and distributed. Some of them were published in American newspapers. Some of them appeared in the Allied documentary film called Death Mills, released in 1946 by the Information Control Division of the American military government in Germany. Some of them would be entered, in time, as exhibits in the prosecution case at Nuremberg. None of them showed General Patton behind the barracks. But Bradley remembered, and in his book he wrote it down. The man who had stood at the Rhine on the 22nd of March, urinating into the river with theatrical contempt, was not the same man on the 13th of April. The man who had, 3 weeks earlier, considered the Waffen SS to be soldiers of a regrettable government was, by the 2nd week of April, in the early stages of a moral revision he would not complete before his death. The reports about SS prisoners attacking American medics continued to arrive at the Judge Advocate's office through April. They were processed. They were filed. They moved up the chain to Rams, and from Rams they began to be sorted by a small staff of military lawyers who were preparing to support, in the months ahead, the largest war crimes investigation ever conducted by any government. Patton's role in that process had already ended, in the sense that mattered. He had set the policy. He had let the system run. He had, in the case of these incidents, done the thing his record demanded he do. What was changing in the second week of April was not his policy. What was changing was his understanding of what he had been protecting. A 19-year-old American medic in a Pennsylvania surgeon's basement aid station had been struck by a Waffen SS officer. The medic had filed a report. The report had moved up the chain. The chain had done its work. It was a small thing. It had not, in itself, mattered, but it was one of thousands, and on the eastern edge of the Third Army Zone, in a town called Ordruf, the larger thing had finally become visible. The general who had walked through it had been changed by it. What he would do with that change, in the 8 months he had left to live, is the story that follows. By the end of April 1945, the German army in the West had ceased to exist as a coordinated force. The Third Army crossed into Bavaria. It crossed into Austria. On the 6th of May, its lead elements reached the outskirts of Pilsen, in Czechoslovakia, where Patton's orders required him to stop. He objected. He wanted to push to Prague. The objection was overruled. He recorded his frustration in his diary, and he obeyed. On the 8th of May 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. The reports kept arriving at the Judge Advocate's desk for another 2 weeks. Then they began to slow. By the middle of June, the flow of incident reports from the front had been replaced by a different kind of paperwork. Demobilization rosters, property accountings, personnel transfers. The army that had crossed the Rhine in March was beginning to dissolve into the army of occupation, and from there into the civilian lives the men were preparing to return to. The file on the Waffen SS officer who had struck the 19-year-old medic in the basement aid station went where files of that kind went in 1945. It was sorted by the War Crimes branch of the Theatre Judge Advocate. It was categorized by type, by location, by suspected unit. It was bundled with thousands of similar files into the boxes that would be shipped in the months to come to a warehouse outside of Munich, where they would be reviewed by a small staff of American military lawyers who were standing up a series of trials at a former concentration camp called Dachau. Those trials, conducted by the United States Army between 1945 and 1948, would process approximately 1,672 German defendants. Hundreds were sentenced to death. 73 of those sentences were ultimately carried out. Many more received long prison terms. Most of the cases concerned violations against American servicemen, against Allied prisoners of war, against the inmates of concentration camps liberated by American forces. Whether the SS officer in this story was among them is not documented in the publicly available records. The case file, like thousands of others, would have moved through the system by reference number in a stream of paper that no individual eye followed from beginning to end. The principle that mattered, however, did not depend on the individual outcome. The principle was that the report had been filed. The principle was that the chain had carried it. The principle was that violations of the laws of war were being treated as legal matters, processable through formal procedure, even when the men involved were unknown and the consequences unverifiable. This is the part of the story that does not satisfy the way endings are supposed to satisfy. The SS officer disappears from the record. The medic disappears from the record. The system goes on. The medic, by the most likely accounting, was demobilized at some point in the summer or fall of 1945. He boarded a troop ship from Le Havre or Marseille or Antwerp. He arrived in New York or Boston or Newport News. He was processed through a separation center. He received a discharge button, sometimes called the ruptured duck. He received a separation pay of $200 and the right to wear his uniform for 30 days. Then he became one of the 16 million American veterans of the Second World War. He went home to a town in Pennsylvania, or Ohio, or Iowa, or California. He found work, he married, he had children. He probably never told them about the cellar. The men of that generation, as the men listening to this story already know, did not tell their children about the cellar. They told them about the parades, and the laughs, and the names of the friends who had not come back. They did not tell them about the slap, or the report, or the moment of restraint. He died, statistically, sometime between the late 1980s and the early 2010s. His name in the records of this story is not preserved. What he did that morning, however, is preserved, not as his individual act, but as one of thousands of acts of the same kind. The cumulative weight of those acts is the architecture that the men in London and Washington and Nuremberg were assembling around him while he was on his troop ship home. He never knew. That is the price of what he did, and it is the gift of it. For General Patton, the months that followed the surrender were not kind. He was given command of the 15th Army in June 1945. This was not a field command. It was a headquarters tasked with compiling the operational history of the European campaign. For a man who had defined his entire life by motion and combat, it was a desk job. He took it without enthusiasm. He spent the summer in occupied Bavaria, in the town of Bad Tölz, in a confiscated headquarters building, signing routine paperwork and supervising the work of historians. He went hunting on the weekends. He wrote letters to his wife, Beatrice, in Massachusetts. He recorded in his diary an accelerating dissatisfaction with the policies of military government in occupied Germany. The dissatisfaction came to a head on the 22nd of September 1945 at a press conference at his headquarters. A reporter asked him about the denazification policies of the American occupation, about the policy of removing former members of the Nazi Party from positions of administrative authority. Patton answered. His answer, in the recorded transcript, compared the membership of the Nazi Party in Germany to the membership of the Republican and Democratic parties in the United States. He suggested that most Germans had joined the Nazi Party not from ideological conviction, but from political necessity, the way Americans joined one of the two major parties at home. The comparison was, at best, unfortunate. At worst, it was an apology for the regime whose camps he had walked through 5 months earlier, behind whose barracks he had vomited into the grass, whose mayor in Ohrdruf had hanged himself in his own house. The reaction was immediate. The newspapers reported it. Congress reacted. The State Department reacted. Eisenhower was forced to act. On the 2nd of October 1945, Eisenhower met with Patton in Frankfurt and informed him of the decision. The change of command ceremony, in which Lieutenant General Lucien Truscott assumed command of the Third Army, took place 5 days later, on the 7th of October. It was the end of his career. He was reassigned to a smaller administrative command. He was kept on the rolls. He was given the courtesies due his rank. But the army he had built, the men he had led, the work he had defined himself by, were no longer his. He spent the next 2 months in a kind of suspended quiet. He read, he hunted, he wrote in his diary. He prepared, he told Beatrice in a letter, to come home in time for Christmas. On the morning of the 9th of December, 1945, he set out from his headquarters near Bad Nauheim for a hunting trip in the Rhineland. The car was a Cadillac staff sedan, requisitioned for senior officer use. Patton was in the back seat. Beside him sat Major General Hobart Gay, his chief of staff and longtime friend. The driver was a young enlisted soldier named Horace Woodring. At approximately 11:45 in the morning, on a stretch of road outside the town of Mannheim, a 2.5-ton GMC truck driven by an army soldier named Robert L. Thompson made a left turn across the path of the Cadillac. The collision was slow. The Cadillac was moving at approximately 30 miles per hour. The truck was nearly stopped, but Patton was leaning forward at the moment of impact. He was not wearing a seatbelt. Seatbelts in 1945 were not standard equipment in American automobiles. He was thrown forward into the steel partition that separated the driver's compartment from the passenger area. The injury was a fracture dislocation of the third and fourth cervical vertebrae. The spinal cord was severed. He was paralyzed from the neck down. Beatrice flew to Germany. She arrived on the 11th of December. She found him conscious, breathing on his own, unable to move anything below his collarbone. He spoke with her. He read when she held the book for him. He received visitors. He understood his condition. He understood the likely outcome. He lived in the 130th Station Hospital in Heidelberg for 12 days. On the 21st of December 1945, at approximately 5:45 in the afternoon, Central European time, he died of pulmonary edema and congestive heart failure, secondary to his spinal injury. He was 60 years old. He had asked Beatrice, in one of their conversations during those 12 days, to be buried with his men. She honored the request. He was interred at the Luxembourg American Cemetery in the town of Ham alongside the soldiers of the Third Army who had fallen in the Battle of the Bulge and the campaigns that followed. The grave was marked with a standard white cross, identical to those of the men around him. There was no special monument. There was no elevated plot. He lay among the dead of the army he had commanded. The Nuremberg trials had opened in the city of Nuremberg on the 20th of November 1945, while Patton was at his desk at the 15th Army headquarters in Bad Nauheim. He had read about them in the newspapers. He had not lived to see the verdicts. On the 1st of October 1946, 10 months after Patton's death, the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg delivered its judgments. 12 of the major defendants were sentenced to death, 3 were sentenced to life imprisonment, 4 received shorter prison terms. 3 were acquitted. The principle the tribunal established, that individuals could be held criminally accountable under international law for violations of the laws of war and for crimes against humanity, became the foundation of the body of international humanitarian law that has governed armed conflict, however imperfectly, ever since. That body of law was built on testimony, it was built on documents, it was built on the cumulative record of incidents large and small that had been collected, processed, and preserved by the men who fought the war. A piece of that record had come from a basement aid station in Germany in the first week of April 1945, when a 19-year-old American medic, struck across the face by a Waffen SS officer he was trying to treat, had asked to make a report. The general who commanded the army that received that report was not a hero. He was a man with 2 slaps of his own in his record, with a speech at Biscari that had been entered into a court-martial file, with a press conference at Bad Tölz that had ended his career, with a moral revision he had begun too late to complete. He was a man. What he did in the end was let the system work. He did not visit the cellar, he did not see the medic, he did not, in any document that survives, know the young man's name. But the report moved through his army, the file was opened, the chain held. That is what command is in the end when command is done correctly. It is not the man at the bridge in the cold March wind, it is not the gesture at the river. It is not the speech, or the slap, or the pearl-handled revolver in the holster. It is the procedure that protects the 19-year-old in the cellar from the consequences of doing the right thing. The men of that generation, the men who fought that war, the men who built the world that came after it, are nearly gone now. The youngest of them are in their late 90s. They are dying at a rate of several hundred a day. The number of living American veterans of the Second World War, as of this account, stands at less than 1% of those who served. The accounts they left are the accounts we have. The records they preserved are the records we read. The system they built, the imperfect and contested and constantly endangered system of international humanitarian law, is the system we still depend on when we depend on anything at all to restrain what soldiers and statesmen are capable of doing to one another. It is not permanent. It was made. It can be unmade. The record is the reminder. The medic in the cellar is the reminder. The general who let the system work, even once, even reluctantly, even for reasons that had nothing to do with principle and everything to do with the scars on his own career, is the reminder. The bridge at Oppenheim, the cellar in the hill country, the grass behind the barracks at Ohrdruf, the road outside Mannheim, the White Cross at Ham, these are the places that hold the story. The story is finished now. The men who lived it are gone or are leaving. What they did remains.